Okay, welcome everyone to the Drexel University Global Education Colloquium. I know there are going to be a few more people joining us as we come, but we'll get started. My name is Christy Kelly, and I'm a faculty member here at Drexel University in the School of Education. And it's my pleasure to be hosting this year's Global Education Colloquium. We have a wonderful series of speakers coming in monthly to share their research and their expertise working on education issues around the world. The Global Education Colloquium was started in 2013, so you can check out our website and see all of our past speakers. We've recorded and archived their talks, and we're very excited this year to be starting a new book series where we'll be linking their current publications as well as teaching notes and policy notes to their talks to be able to share the information more broadly. Today, we're very excited to have Dr. Payal Shah here with us to kickstart our 2020-21 speaker series. She is an associate professor of educational foundations and qualitative inquiry in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of South Carolina. She conducts critical, ethnographic, and participatory research on gender, education, and development in India. She's published across the fields of international and comparative education, qualitative inquiry, and women and gender studies. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in qualitative inquiry, social foundations of education, and comparative and international education. Dr. Shah is currently on the board of the Comparative and International Education Society as well, and has held a variety of leadership positions within the field. We're very excited to have her talking about her 8 years study of the relational and intergenerational empowerment across girls' education in Gujarat, India. For those of you who are new to the colloquium, we ask that you keep your microphones muted during the presentation portion, but please include any chats, comments, questions into the chat box, and we'll be monitoring that as we go. At the end of Dr. Shah's presentation, we'll be reading out those questions, but assuming that everything is okay, we can also ask you to unmute yourselves and you can ask your questions directly. So without further ado, I introduce Dr. Shah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored and excited to be here and to get to share some of my research with you today. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for that wonderful introduction, and again for the invitation to join all of you. So as a qualitative researcher and an international comparative education scholar, I conduct ethnographic research at the intersection of education, gender, culture, and society. And at the core of my scholarship lies a deep concern with the theoretical, empirical, and epistemological approaches to the study of gender and its intersection with education. In general, I try to interrogate the common narrative of schooling as the ultimate key to progress, development, and equity. I place my work in a larger political, social, economic, and cultural context to situate the experiences of individuals within, while simultaneously problematizing the larger processes of modernity, globalization, and international development that guide educational policymaking in India. Today, I'm going to share with you some of the work that I've been doing in India over the past 12 years. And in particular, I'm going to discuss one of my primary research projects that is kind of wrapping up, but then I'll talk about how it's segueing into my current work, but which was an 8-year longitudinal ethnography that examines how processes of empowerment evolve in rural marginalized girls' lives as they receive formal primary education, transition out of the primary educational system, and embark on the next stages of their life. So girls' education and empowerment, right, is considered a critical component of the development process and efforts to achieve gender equality. Girls' education is viewed as an intrinsic right and a critical lever to reaching other development objectives such as alleviating poverty and promoting social change. The belief underlying many girls' education initiatives is that education leads to empowerment and is encapsulated by the African proverb that's adapted by the development community: if you educate a girl, you educate the nation. However, these transformative goals do not match the more instrumental and pragmatic programs where success is determined by outcomes such as enrollment, basic skill acquisition, and job market entry. Focused on enrollment and outcomes, most scholarship focuses on understanding the various barriers that girls face in going to school, and then explores the impact of girls' education interventions. There is less empirical attention that focuses on how girls' education programs exist within a broader sociocultural context, and importantly, how girls themselves understand and internalize their educational experiences and negotiate between these experiences and their larger sociocultural contexts. So in my research, I seek to challenge, as I mentioned, these linear global narratives of education, empowerment, and social change that dominate mainstream development discourses, and instead show how these processes are experienced by individuals in multifaceted and non-uniform ways. And so in my research, I seek to explore the nexus of education, international development, and gender from an interdisciplinary perspective. I engage in explicit theorizing of the unique circumstances of adolescent girls within processes of education, development, and empowerment. And I really seek to inform policy and practice about how educational initiatives are appropriated. That's how they're adopted, translated, and contested on the ground. So specifically, I ask, how do we understand girls' education and empowerment as a complex and relational process? And to address this question, I empirically investigate the education-empowerment link by examining how lived educational experiences illuminate the social processes that both define and characterize empowerment. So today I'm just going to share the stories of two girls, Lata and Rekha, to look at, one, how empowerment is a holistic and relational process, and second, where we really see the importance of paying attention to power in the relations among families, schools, communities, and the state. Before we jump into this, I want to pause and give you a working definition about how I'm conceptualizing empowerment. And in general, I consider empowerment as an increase in an individual's capacity to gain power and control over the decisions and resources that affect the quality of her life. This definition sees empowerment as a process, in contrast to empowerment being operationalized as a fixed outcome measured through direct indicators, such as economic growth, increased educational attainment, and increased political participation. In this way, the emphasis is on the specific processes of empowerment as they change over time, and empowerment is viewed as an ideal goal which cannot be achieved in a fixed sense. Now, this definition of empowerment is situated within a gender and development, or GAD, framework, which provides us a more critical analysis of gender schooling in society and goes beyond economic solutions to development. GAD, as you may be familiar with, highlights the importance of gendered structures of inequality by focusing on the interplay between the personal and institutional, family and community, individual and society, and school and community. But I also seek to add to this GAD framework by engaging a post-colonial framework that complicates the GAD framework a bit, right? And also focuses on complicating development practices that tend to essentialize or universalize gender, and in particular notions of third world women. So specifically to explore the empowerment process, I focus on the role here of agency. And many scholars see the expansion of agency as being one of the primary components of the empowerment process. In particular, I draw upon the work of Kabir and Ben Habib to define agency as the ability to participate, enact one's voice, and take action. And here, an increase in agency is thought to enable from, quote, women to move from enduring complete compliance to constraining and unequal gender norms, to questioning those norms in the face of potential opportunities, to changing their aspirations, as well as their ability to seek and achieve desired outcomes. Agency, however, exists in relation to a larger structural context of resources, such as education, institutions such as family, and sociocultural processes, including traditions, moral codes, and gender norms. These components of structure do not exist independently from one another, but are instead constantly being produced and reproduced through interaction. Research on empowerment and agency tends to focus on the opportunity structures themselves, such as, for example, education. However, what we know is that access to these structures does not necessarily translate into individuals actually being able to enact agency. So some scholars suggest that engaging in research that looks at agency from a broader perspective, right? So this includes whether an opportunity structure for choice exists, whether the individual chooses to use the opportunity, and whether this choice actually brings about desired outcomes. I actually also argue that research must go beyond descriptions of context and outcomes to focus on how the girls navigate the complex intersections between opportunities and structures, especially when we focus on adolescent girls who are positioned as marginalized. Therefore, I focus on how girls exercise their agency through examinations of how they negotiate between structure and opportunity. Importantly and epistemologically, I see these girls as active agents who do not passively internalize external constraints. So I situate the study of girls' education and empowerment in India, and in particular the western state of Gujarat. Like many developing countries, India suffers from a severe marginalization of women that cuts across caste, class, and geographic boundaries. Within India, of the 67 million children out of school, 62% are still estimated to be girls. Furthermore, 82% of girls who are in school drop out by the time they get to secondary school. And 15 to 24-year-old girls are still twice as likely to be illiterate as boys of that age. And this is according to data from 2017 in India. In 2019, Gujarat had the second highest percentage of girls between the ages of 15 and 16 out of school, as reported by the Annual Status of Education report. Therefore, Gujarat provides a really interesting context to study gender education and social change, because on the one hand, it has achieved very high levels of economic development, but on the other hand, has very low levels of social development, especially in regards to gender equality and disparities between men and women. So the girls who were at the center of this longitudinal project were educated as adolescents in a national educational program called the Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya, or the KGBV program. The KGBV program was a public girls residential school program designed to enable the most marginalized girls to attend school. This program was instituted in 2005 and was one of the kind of latest of a long history of policies that had an explicit goal of achieving universal primary education across India and an implicit goal of improving the situation of women and girls. The KGBV program was conceptualized in partnership between the Indian government and the NGO Care India, and was based upon a girls' education intervention implemented by Care India. And it uniquely employed a curriculum developed by Care India focused particularly on fostering girls' empowerment. Therefore, the KGBV program has been hailed as a precedent-setting program promoting girls' education and empowerment. And as I mentioned, it targets these adolescent girls who are considered the hardest to reach. So these are rural girls who have either never attended school or have dropped out at some point at the primary level. And I conducted research in one particular KGBV school in Gujarat, which I call the KGBV Karwal School. So today I'm going to present research from what turned into an 8-year kind of longitudinal ethnographic project. And the project took place primarily over two phases. The first phase took place from 2008 to 2010, where I conducted a 2-year multi-level ethnography of this one particular KGBV Karwal school. I lived at this school for 2 years, where I supplemented ethnographic methods with participatory methods, including photo voice. The culmination of my ethnographic research included an exhibit of the girls' photographic images, where the KGBV Karwal girls, teachers, and I collectively organized this exhibit, an open discussion session for parents and community members. So following the exhibit, a critical dialogue with community members, parents, teachers, and students followed, where issues of gender norms and practices and areas for change were openly debated and discussed. The exhibit was significant as it provided insights into how leaving the safe space of the KGBV school and re-entering a hierarchical normative context might impact the ways in which girls were able to continue and actualize their understandings of social, cultural, and educational issues. So given the insights from this research, I realized that understanding this education and empowerment link as a process necessitated that I follow the girls into the next stages of their life, whether it be that they continued with their education, dropped out of school, got married, whatever. So over the course of multiple fieldwork trips from 2012 to 2016, I engaged in follow-up research with the 15 girls that I worked with most closely from the school. locating these girls every time I went back to India, which was about every 6 months, was a monumental task. The only information that I had once the girls left the school, and once I left the school, was their father's name and the name of their father's village. So many of these families and these girls are migrants and they're nomadic. And so figuring out where they were at these kind of particular points in time was not at all a straightforward task. So over the course of 1 month and for one of my initial visits, I visited the natal villages of the 15 girls with whom I worked closely with for the 2 years that I was at the school. And I walked into these villages and started asking around. To my astonishment, many of the villagers actually recognized me as that woman from America who lived with the girls at the school. And importantly, they all mentioned the photographs in the exhibit. They went above and beyond to help me track down these girls. And at the end, I was actually able to locate 11 out of 15 of those original girls. Once I found these girls, I sought to elicit their experience and reflections on schooling as they prepared for and as they described what the next stages of their life were going to look like. I also incorporated the perspectives of others close to these girls, including parents, family members, other family members, teachers, and community members. I used semi-structured interviews, observations, and general kind of dialogical discussions with the girls and the broader community. But the thing that really struck me was the fact that the Photo Voice project was so meaningful, right? So not only did they remember it, but they, when I would walk into some of their homes, girls would run off into another room and pull out the actual hard copies of the photographs, the albums that they had all gotten from all of the pictures that they took throughout the project. And they still held on to them, and they still spoke so fondly of the project and of the sense of kind of self-worth and engagement that they felt from engaging in the process. And it reiterated for me something that theoretically I believed in, but I could now see, right, what it meant, what relational research, right, and what kind of relational nature of doing research actually meant for researchers, but also for participants. And so I draw from this relational standpoint to define the core of what it means for me as a gender and development scholar rooted in the fields of comparative education and sociology. And so I tie these fields together through an epistemological and methodological commitment that really seeks to challenge traditional hierarchies of the knowledge production process and incorporate perspectives and insights of non-Western women and girls into research policy and practice. And I also use education as a lens to engage with and problematize this concept of culture, right, which is often used as an essentialist concept distinguishing the West from the other. And instead to approaching culture as a context-specific but also evolving and non-static entity. And so I draw from a lot of feminist and post-colonial critiques of development and theories of empowerment, and also the sociology of education, right, where schools are seen as being simultaneously transformative, but also reproductive institutions in society. So now I'm going to turn to the stories of Rekha and Lata, who I showed you at the beginning of the slide, to show you kind of how I investigate and understand this education and empowerment link. So Rekha was a charismatic and intelligent 19-year-old girl by the time I left her, who many of the other girls at the school followed. She belongs to a caste within the larger Kodi Patel caste, and the Patels are a caste that occupationally tend to be either small-scale, land-owning farmers or tenant farmers. Rekha had one older sister and one older brother. Her father passed away when she was young, making her the daughter of a widow who was left in deep poverty after her husband's passing due to inheritance and land ownership practices. Rekha's mother worked as a day laborer on a farm, and her brother was a truck driver. Economic pressures forced Rekha's sister to agree to an arranged marriage where she was physically abused, and after months of marriage, she committed suicide. Suicide carries significant stigma across these communities, and her sister's action brought shame to her entire family. Rekha was strikingly articulate and reflective and was one of the first girls to engage with me in discussions regarding patriarchy and tradition. But she also had a sullenness to her, most likely due to her family circumstances, and she felt deeply the pressures that her mother felt. She studied at the KGBV school for 3 years, graduating from the 7th grade in 2010. Now, Lata is also was also 19 years when I finished working with her. And she has 3 sisters and 2 brothers. And she also belongs to this caste, the scheduled caste of Kodi Patels, but a subcaste slightly higher than Rekha's. Her family did not own any land, and neither of her parents had any formal education. Her father was a laborer in which he worked on somebody else's farm during the day, and he drove a chakra, which is a local 3-wheeled taxi, in the mornings and in the evenings. Her mother took care of the family home and was also a day laborer on a farm. For my time at the school, Lata's situation was unusual, as she continued to live at the school after completing the 7th grade in 2009. And so she used the school kind of as a boarding facilities for when she was attending a nearby girls' secondary school. So now I'm going to show us how Lata and Rekha's stories help us understand how both girls exercise their agencies when embarking on significant next steps in their lives. So both Lata and Rekha were educated at the KGBV school as adolescents, right? And again, when we think about adolescent education, it is considered by or framed by the development community as a key period of education, because it is a time where most girls drop out of school, despite the fact that evidence shows that adolescent girls who attend school delay marriage and childbearing, are less vulnerable to disease, and tend to have increased earning power, right? So we see these kind of instrumental reasons for why adolescent-aged girls' education is important. It's also focused on because it is a critical time where girls become women, right? When decisions are related to marriage, childbearing, continuing education, or getting a job are made. Again, both Lata and Rekha represent these hardest to reach adolescent age girls who are kind of the primary recipients or targets of girls' education programs. And both girls face intersecting obstacles to educational equality based on poverty, rurality, caste, class, gender, and sociocultural practices, including practices of parda that reinforce marginalization. Because adolescence represents such a crucial time in a girl's life, looking at how girls navigate the strategic life choices of continuing their education or otherwise provides important insights into the processes, into understanding processes of agency and empowerment. So after graduating from the KGBV school, Rekha and Lata both expressed a desire to continue with their schooling, despite the prevailing sociocultural norms that do not support girls' education past the primary level. And so Rekha explains, if we've studied, then we may be of great benefit to our in-laws' house. We might also be required to work less, maybe work from home. If we are illiterate, then mother-in-law and father-in-law will ask us to look after the farm and would not allow us to do a job. If we're literate, then perhaps we will even not have to do much household work. So, they had aspirations of living a better and a different life after being educated. However, leaving the safe space of the KGBV school meant that both girls re-entered a formal, patriarchal, and hierarchical sociocultural environment that was full of norms to which they had to adhere. At the time of their graduations from the KGBV school, Lata and Rekha's families also had aspirations for their daughters. In Lata's case, her father wanted to be supportive of her schooling, as they did her brothers. But he said, "It is now the time for Lata to get married. It is not common in our community for a girl to go to school when she should be married." Within Lata's family, marriage took precedent to schooling. In Rekha's case, her difficult family situation conditioned her mother's aspirations. Rekha says, "My mother says that the only way to secure my future is to ensure that I marry. At this age, it is very difficult for me to go to school." So we see how continuing school comes into conflict with broader gendered and sociocultural norms, in this case, marriage, and how this affects how Lata and Rekha can exercise their agency and what paths they might be able to take after completing 7th grade. So as I mentioned, after completing the 7th grade, Lata actually continued to live at the KGBV school and attended a local girls' secondary school for 2 years. In 2015, she was in her first year of college, and she attended the local college in a nearby city while living with relatives. Lata was proud that she was the only person from her extended family and subcaste to have studied this far, and she states that it gives me inspiration that I want to study further. I want to become a teacher. And here's how she explains how she managed to continue studying after the 7th grade. She says, "I have pushed my mother and my father to let me study. I am very interested in studying. I do not like labor and farm work. I love to study. Whenever there is a vacation, I work as a laborer and earn money to recover the expenses of my education. I earn all the money to pay for my books, and that way I'm able to keep studying. From childhood, I've been asking questions. Why boys can study and girls cannot? Why do women have to do all of the housework? They know that this is my nature, and they are slowly trying to understand what I say. At the KGBV school, I learned how to speak with them and I gained the strength to fight for what I want. And for now, they're respecting and listening to me. And so Lata's comments really illustrate this belief in education as an investment in future well-being, right? And a desire to value this investment over traditional gender norms and roles. Now, Rekha, after graduating from the KGBV school in the 7th grade, Rekha actually did not continue on to secondary school despite her love of learning and positive educational experiences. She was the only girl from her KGBV cohort who actually secured employment after completing the 7th grade. She became a local doctor's assistant where she wrote prescription letters, directions for care, and helped work with patients. And she described her work as very interesting, and I can use what I learned at the KGBV school so much about how to speak with people, reading and writing, and I'm just learning so much. When I asked her why she didn't continue with school, she said that there was just too much pressure to go out and earn money. In addition to supporting the household, she stated that her mother was very worried about securing her marriage and needed more money for her dowry. And so Rekha felt that she was left with only one option, to give up on schooling and seek employment. And so despite having to end her education after the 7th grade, her comments still show how she found value in and strength from her educational experiences. So once we learn about how Rekha and Lata's lives unfolded after finishing the 7th grade, right, it's easy to conclude that Rekha's experience represent failure, or just another story about girls dropping out, and that Lata's represents success. But again, by focusing on these outcomes, we do not get a full picture or understanding of the empowerment process, right? Instead, by looking at the microdynamics of how girls enact their agency, and in particular, the negotiations that they undertake, we can learn more about the nuances of what processes of empowerment might be able to look like. For Rekha, her difficult family circumstances were catalysts for the decision to drop out of school and work. Her mother spent long days working as a tenant farmer, and Rekha stated that there was nobody left at home to do work. Mother was having a hard time doing it all, so I had to drop out. It does not look good that I leave my mother to study. So Rekha's remarks allude to the strong sense of intergenerational responsibility prevalent in Gujarati society and the importance of family obligations. Right? Rekha's situation illustrates how the decision to go to school is not an individual decision. It's not only about a family or family members recognizing the value of education as an investment. When I asked Rekha if her mother supported her in her studies, she replied, "Of course, Didi, she wanted me to continue, but there was no way I could. It was not the path for me, even though I was very fond of studying." And so here there are economic social circumstances, the social stigma of being the daughter of a widow and the sister of a suicide victim, and strong gender-related sociocultural norms conditioned the opportunities available for Rekha. There and many others across Gujarat and India, circumstances did not allow them to invest in education further for their future well-being. And in a sense, despite recognizing education as an investment, the needs and circumstances of the family outweigh the needs of an individual. Lata's story now, unlike Rekha's, was more unique than the norm in the region, but provides additional insights into how Gujarati girls might understand and actively negotiate the expectations around them. Due to Lata's persistence and willingness to speak up to her family, Lata was able to participate in decision-making related to continuing school. And through these actions, Lata challenged traditional gender norms where girls do not study past the 7th grade. Further, Lata explained that her insistence to keep studying had effects on her family. She says that my father's thinking it has drastically changed. He is now willing to educate me. Earlier, he was not interested in me studying further. And so Lata's experience illustrates how girls themselves can play a role in helping push back against traditional norms and roles and change the expectations or attitudes of family members around them, family members who hold significant decision-making authority for these girls. However, Lata's experiences also revealed how parents' decision-making authority is also conditioned by larger sociocultural factors. Her parents were subjected to wider social norms that hinder the extent to which girls can influence their parents in decision-making. Lata explained that her efforts were primarily directed towards convincing her father, as he made most of the decisions in the house. And she was also chastised by her father for addressing him or trying to bring up this issue in a public space, a few times. And so she learned that any type of negotiation had to take place within the private sphere of her home. And she explained the nuance of the situation when she said, "In our neighborhood, when everybody is chatting and my father speaks and I try to speak, he tells me that you don't speak in between, you stay quiet. We girls are not allowed to talk much in the home or especially outside in front of others." And so we see the relational breadth of girls' decision-making also goes beyond the family, right? It intersects with wider community-based norms and practices. Now, if we look more deeply into how Lata engages in negotiation, we learn another important insight regarding the intersection of sociocultural norms, context, and girls' agency. Lata's continued schooling came at significant costs to other family members. Her extended family broke local social norms by allowing her to stay with them while she attended college, which is typically only done for boys. Further, the responsibilities that Lata would have had to assume as the eldest female child fell to her two sisters, who dropped out of school to do the household duties. In the absence of any income from Lata and the costs associated with her attending school, her sisters also had to work in the fields. So Lata explains it was not so much that they didn't want to continue studying, but I was studying. And if so they were studying, then my mother and father would not have been able to cope. So they gave up their studies and they started working at home as laborers so that I could study. Her mother also clarified how these choices affected the family. Her mother says, yes, initially we said no to Lata because at that time my children were very young. And when I go to the farms to work, I require somebody to take care of them. But when Lata pushed to continue with school, I got my other daughter, dropped out of school instead of Lata. So the example of what happened within Lata's family addresses how the gains for one in the family often come at the expense of others, right? In Rekha's experience, she had to drop out as she did not have any other sisters or extended family to support her. Contributing to the household income by her was necessary. And so both Rekha's and Lata's experiences illuminate the relational nature of agency and decision-making. Now, I've talked a lot about marriage, right? And so in addition to parental authority over educational decisions, parents in rural Gujarat also decide with whom and when a girl will marry. And marriage represents one of the most significant sociocultural and economic institutions for families and communities in Gujarat, as well as in India and around the world. And both Lata and Rekha come from communities where engagements were decided at a very early age, and families followed strict rules regarding marriage within caste. Practices of patrilocal exogamy, along with dowry, greatly affect the amount of time and money a family is willing to invest in a girl. And many times this idea of marrying up counterintuitively acts as a disincentive for educating females, as it actually might increase dowry costs. Further, educating a female does not necessarily mean that the girl is viewed as a more desirable marriage partner. Thus, in order to save for marriage-related costs and to ensure that the widest array of suitors is available, parents focus on getting their daughters married at the right time, which directly conflicts with efforts required to keep adolescent-aged girls in school. And so here we see one of Lata's sisters who's not in school learning how to do some traditional embroidery. And girls from this community have to intricately embroider clothing in this manner as part of their dowry. And it's a very time-consuming process, but considered an important cultural activity. And so Lata's sister here, who is about 10, is not in school. Lata, however, was able to participate in marriage-related decision-making, right? And she says that my mother and father, everybody wanted to get me engaged after 10th standard, and I wouldn't have been able to study for my 11th and 12th. Then I told my father that I'm not yet 18, let me complete my 11th and 12th, and then you do my engagement. My grandfather is not there, and everybody else told my father to do my engagement, but still I told him to let me study. And so he agreed, and he let me complete my 11th and 12th, and then he set my engagement. So in that way, if I say anything to my father, he now might agree. So given Lata's persistence and insistence, she was able to, at the very least, influence her father's decisions regarding when and whom she should marry. She attributed the non-cognitive skills strengthened during her time at the KGBV school and the confidence she gained from those experiences as giving her the strength to assert her desires to her father. Now, when I met with Rekha in 2016, I learned that 2 years previously, she had quit her job and gotten married when she was 16. And now she has an 18-month-old baby girl. Looking back at her KGBV experiences, Rekha stated, it's a shame that I'm not studying now as I was in the school. It would have been really good if I had been able to continue my studies. Instead, it's like I have been married off so young. When I asked her to talk about her current situation, she explained that she did not want to drop out of school, but had to bring in an income again and contribute to her family. She felt lucky that she was able to get a job at the health center. which paid well, and she was able to use her education. But when she was married, 1 year after starting her job, her in-laws did not allow her to continue working. And she shared the main reason that she couldn't working was that in our community, married girls do not roam about outside of the house. Working after marriage is generally not permitted. After marriage, I had to focus on household work and having children. And so Rekha's example illustrates how her strategic life decision-making authority primarily rested in the hands of her parents and then her in-laws. For Rekha, continuing education and working was not considered more important than adhering to traditional gender norms and roles. While Rekha's education did enable her to improve her economic and social standing by marrying into a family with more resources than her natal family, it came with her having to make significant compromises. Rekha's comment that it was her duty now to focus on having children is significant as it reveals the nature of her agency in relation to childbearing. When I asked her what she thought about being a mother, she looked over at her mother-in-law, who was sitting with her the whole time, and then looked down and said, "I am so young, but it is what we have to do." So from Lata and Rekha's experiences, we see that girls' agency is influenced by a multitude of factors, including education, but also economic resources, family obligations, hierarchical adult-child relationships, and gender norms and roles. And so while their educational experiences did provide them additional opportunities to exercise agency and contribute to their future well-being, it was interlinked with other factors. On the one hand, Lata was able to work with her parents to find future in-laws that would support her continuing to study and potentially get a job. And Rekha was able to marry into a family with more financial resources than her own. But we also see how an investment in education often conflicts with gender norms and roles, community expectations, and economic circumstances, making the intersection of education with wider structures an illuminating site to examine agency as negotiation. Finally, when Rekha reflected on her life now in light of her educational experiences and previous aspirations, she looked me in the eye and she said, "This is my life now, Payal P, but it will not be the life of my daughter. For her to live the life I dream of, this is what we must do." And so this final insight illuminates the long-lasting effects of education and the intergenerational nature of the education empowerment link. Rekha's story clearly illuminates for us the varying roles and sacrifices that people have to endure for social change to occur. So again, right, once we learn about how Rekha's and Lata's lives unfolded after finishing school, it's easy to conclude that Rekha's experiences represent what it means to be a rural, disempowered Gujarati woman. And when we consider Lata's experiences, we consider her the picture of empowerment. Their stories underscore, however, that it's not sufficient to learn about an individual's ability to make choices by only looking at their life choices and outcomes. It is necessary to deeply consider the context and conditions under which they exercise their agency and examine the microdynamics of how they negotiate between opportunities and constraints. From them, we learn that to better understand how empowerment might lead to social change, we need to go beyond descriptions of context to consider context as dynamic, or in other words, to examine how contexts themselves change as a result of agentic action. And finally, Rekha and Lata remind us that changes in individual agency alone are not clear predictors of social change, right? This sort of change requires change on multiple fronts. And so agency empowerment is not only a relational process, right, but also an intergenerational one. And so Lata and Rekha's stories show us how girls internalize and appropriate empowerment-oriented educational experiences and how they enact agency within structure. By examining how social norms and cultural practices overlap with material conditions, I show how it is possible to critique the social order of my participants without falling back on a culture as problem argument. Insights from these girls' narratives show us how sociocultural processes such as empowerment are experienced in the lives of individuals over time in a nonlinear and uneven manner, right? Challenging these linear narratives of development and modernity. But their stories also show us how agency and empowerment are both relational and intergenerational. This has important implications for how we design and in particular how we evaluate girls' education programs and larger programs aimed at empowerment and gender equality and equity. So while this research has provided, I think, really interesting insights into how the actions and decisions of these young women resonate over time in their own lives, we still need much more research that examines how these intergenerational and relational components of agency play out not only in the lives of individuals, but how this might transform relations at the community and the collective level. And so this kind of leads into my current research project that I have been very slowly working on for the past 2 to 3 years, where I am seeking to investigate how educational experiences lead towards collective empowerment and social change. And so in this way, I'm seeking to further a reconceptualization of empowerment and agency from a focus on the individual to the collective, which better mirrors the negotiation and decision-making processes in non-Western and post-colonial contexts. To do this, I have partnered with and have signed an MOU with the Mahila Samakya program in Gujarat, and with a particular Mahila collective that has spun off from the Mahila Samakya program. The MS program in Gujarat was founded in 1989, and it is the largest non-governmental and state-supported organization across India, with a vision of education as a primary agent for empowerment and gender-oriented social change. To enact this vision over the past 20 plus years, the MS program have run a number of initiatives that include bridge courses to mainstream girls into formal education systems, model schools, KGBV schools, and as a part of the long-term strategy of the MS program, communities are encouraged to form their own collectives that then operate autonomously from the MS program. So I've been able to work with one such community and a group of women who are part of the MS program at its start in the late 1980s in Gujarat. And the way that I was able to engage with this community stems back to what I talked about with the kind of photo voice activities and the power of thinking about research relationally, is that I cultivated relationships with individuals and with organizations starting back, when I was working in India in 2002, 2003, that I've sustained and engaged with over the course of my career that have now enabled me to access groups of women and have a lot of community level support to do this research, right? So it really emphasizes the importance of engagement over a long periods of time and cultivating meaningful relationships with your research participants such that they are seeing the research process as something that they want to support and want to remain engaged in. And this is what enables me to actually engage in participatory research in this next phase of the process, where it is actually the community, the sangha of women, the collective, that is deciding what this project is going to look like. So before the pandemic disrupted everything, we were just at a stage where we were about to begin a series of Skypes. So these are women in villages sitting around a computer, right, where they were going to be Skyping with myself and another woman who was a part of the organization to start brainstorming various ways that they are interested in sharing their stories, in sharing knowledge, right, producing and sharing the knowledge that helps us understand what empowerment and what collective empowerment and community level social change looks like. And so we've been brainstorming this idea of looking at the ways in which folk songs have changed over time, looking at the kind of non-formal ways in which stories and experiences are passed along across generations. And these were all the kind of ideas that they were interested in sharing as a means of us thinking about how we can understand collective empowerment and gender-oriented social change. Now, this all got interrupted by COVID-19. These are rural communities in Western Gujarat, which are some of the hardest hit with COVID and have continued to be very, very, very hard hit. And so what the women actually asked for was that we kind of be bystanders helping them document their experiences navigating the pandemic. And so they have been engaging in their own data collection where they are taking once a day, they are audio recording into WhatsApp and then sending me WhatsApp audio recordings that are really kind of just capturing whatever they're thinking, whatever they're feeling, whatever challenges, whatever struggles, whatever, anything that they want to share about what's going on in their lives right now. And then we have just started a series of interviews where based on some of the things that they're bringing up in their WhatsApp little audio excerpts to me that really get into trying to understand the ways in which they are not only experiencing the pandemic, but the ways in which they are actually able to actualize a lot of the resources that they have built up over time as a part of these Mailas and these Sanghas, right? So we now have, this community has 3 generations of women and girls that have been somehow engaged with education and empowerment sorts of activities, starting in the late 1980s with the Mahila Samakya program. So what sorts of community level, individual, family sorts of resources have they been able to actually build and now engage, right? In times of crisis, in times of chaos, are these systems and structures actually providing them forms of support that they're able to rely upon as they try to navigate through this pandemic? And so that's part of what we're working on right now as we're dealing with kind of the, the immediate challenges of living in a global pandemic. And one thing that I think is really, important to stress, this was not something that I anticipated being able to do. My goal was not, okay, let's continue collecting research during this kind of crazy time, but it was a need that was expressed by these women that I had already built relationships with. They felt like people come to them and interview them and ask them for their stories randomly when they are looking to get something. But in times of crises, there's nobody there to actually document the challenges and the struggles that they are having. And they felt comfortable asking me to be a part of that process with them. And so even in times of, immense chaos and challenges for everybody, I think falling back again on the kind of relational nature of research and the ways in which as researchers we can really be supportive of challenging dominant narratives around what's going on and how communities and how individuals are coping and what marginalization really looks like, what the ways in which inequality manifests themselves, right? We as researchers can play a really important role in helping to illuminate and challenge some of that. So I think I've talked for a long time now, so thank you all very much, but I really look forward to questions talking about either the research I have done or the research that I'm engaged in. I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. What an engaging presentation, and it's great to see research taking place over a long period of time and how it can be mobilized today. Thank you again for sharing your time and expertise today. We do have a few questions that have already been entered into the chat box. So let me call on Jay Bott. If you'd like to speak out your question, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. And I'm also from Surat in Gujarat, but grew up in Mumbai, studied in Mumbai, and did my 3 master's degrees in Philadelphia before working now at Drexel in Philadelphia. My question is, when I see big cities like Surat and Baroda and Ahmedabad, the situation is so different. I have seen girls becoming doctors and engineers and poets and writers, but then what you showed is completely different picture in the villages. So what should be the role of these high profile educated women and people in big cities to empower female empowerment in those villages? Is there a role for us there, and what we can do about it?
Yeah, excellent. That's a great question. And it's hard for me as as an Indian American born in the United States, but of course spending a lot of time in these big cities and then spending my professional career working in the rural areas to say what people should do. I feel I'm quite hesitant in kind of putting that forth, but you're absolutely correct in the sense that the disparities in opportunities and material conditions between those who live in urban areas versus those who live in rural areas, and even within urban areas, right? If we look at the different polls and the other kind of communities within India, we see drastic differences. And I think that a lot, one of the things that can be done is at very much of a structural level and allocation of resources level, right? Recognizing the ways in which this inequality is so embedded within. It's not just about the culture, it's not just about educating people, right? It's providing them these opportunities, providing them these material opportunities, access to structures, access to, the same sorts of schools, the same sorts of professional opportunities, alongside with this idea that urbanization doesn't mean you have to give up your way of life, right? So reconceptualizing what it means to be a modern, urban, educated individual in ways that doesn't require them to abandon, you know, agricultural subsistence or migrant nomadic ways of living, right? That have deep cultural, personal, individual, community value, but are not, have been positioned as being on the fringes or margins of what modernizing society looks like, right? So we've created this kind of dichotomy and a divide where it's very much, if you don't join us, you're going to stay, you're going to be left behind. And so I think part of it is recognizing the system that we have set up and the ways in which it positions particular communities and groups of people as being unable to increase the quality of their lives in some ways without decreasing the quality of their lives by having to give up who they are and their communities and their, you know, their history and their culture. So that's not a very practical answer to your question in terms of what, you know, what people specifically can do, but I think there's still a lot of surprise about the realities, the multiple realities that exist, right, in our backyards, whether that be here in the United States or in India. And so a lot of that is, for me, is kind of getting, you know, illuminating these differences.
Yeah, it's a great work you are doing. It's really very, very important and very appreciative. We're all proud of your work.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
I think we have a question from Flavio Magaya, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. The question is there a government program that can motivate young girls to stay in school and not get married?
There are many government-led initiatives, for sure, that are out there, campaigns, financial incentives to families, and whatnot that have been put forth to try to motivate families to keep their children in school as opposed to getting married. But you know, the situation on the ground is that it's so much more complex than just a decision about like delay marriage and send to school, in the sense that it being such a strong economic institution and also an institution that very much reproduces caste-based hierarchies. It's valued for a lot of different reasons. The idea of securing the right marriage at the right time. And the idea that to go against such a strong institution, I mean, if we think about it, even in the United States, right, there's a lot of pressure to be married and follow a particular sort of life trajectory, regardless of who you are, that you're constantly working against. And so I think, you know, on the one hand, there's, you know, the issues of the impact of challenging these practices, but then there's also for what, right? So for what sorts of educational experiences are they getting? In what ways are their educational experiences actually positioning them to make significant change in their lives such that they actually have a future worth engaging in? So one quick example is that when I started my research, and I visited probably about 15 of these schools before choosing the one that I focused on, there was a lot of kind of controversy around this project at the time, around this program at the time. And when I was speaking to the state gender coordinator, I was asking her to explain to me what was going on. And she said that in the past 6 months, there had been, so the first kind of cohort of girls who had graduated, who had gone through the school, had finished, there was high incidences of suicide. And it was precisely because of this, you know, leaving the safe space of these schools where they are learning all of these ideas about what it looks like for them to be empowered girls and the ways in which they should be engaging with their broader community and their parents. And, you know, their engagements had already, most of their communities, their engagements are done at when they're months old, right? They're infants. And their life was already set in a way. Then they get taken out, they're educated and given these ideas of what they should be doing or what they could be doing, but then they're put right back into that very same context, and they found that they had no opportunities, right? They found that this was really a really challenging place for them to be in, and they would commit suicide. And so those are like the very real implications that we have to think about when we think about the complexities of programs that are oriented towards them having to do one thing, and then what does that mean for everything else that they're complexly kind of integrated with.
Thanks. We actually have a question from Mutindi Ndunda. Would you like to open your mic and ask your question?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. I actually prefer to be called Mutindi because that's the name that my mother gave me, you know. And so congratulations for the work that you're doing. It's very encouraging to have to go back to the villages and work with people, with women, with girls. And I was actually born in the village myself. And so when I was doing my PhD, I decided my research had to be meaningful. I'm going to go back to the village and talk to the women like my mother, who I wondered why they didn't get an education. And it was a very eye-opening experience. I realized I didn't know my mother. I thought I did. I thought I knew everybody. My colleagues who dropped out of school went to Sixth Street business along Mombasa Road, because that was really like the AIDS corridor at that time in 1994. But as I walked with these women and I talked to my friends who had dropped out of school, I realized that, and I was also interrogating the public policies on education. What kind of education is meaningful to women? I just realized that what really level of education do we need to be empowered? For me, now I'm empowered, I have a PhD, I can't, you know, my daughter cannot go back to be circumcised. She cannot go back to that village because I can create opportunities. And I was very frustrated by the fact that the education that we emphasize for those women, it's not adequate. So how have you thought about this? How much education does a woman need to be empowered? And in my case was mothers would spend every penny to educate their children. But then at the end of the day, the kids don't get any jobs. They come back again. And so I don't know anything much about India. I would love to hear more, even go there, experience that. So what are your thoughts about that? Meaningful empowerment that makes a difference in these women's lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you raised two really important points. The first being that, you know, what do you need to be empowered? It goes back to kind of when I talked about the way I conceptualize and understand empowerment, that I see it as a process that's never really ever achieved, right? We are constantly, I think, you know, even we may have received all of the education possible, but there's always more to learn. There's always more ways to grow. There's always more ways to push, you know, things, I think, around us in terms of, you know, is empowerment only at the individual level? What does empowerment again at the collective level look like? And so I never really see empowerment as being something that's over, that's done with, right? But is instead a process that has its ups and downs. At times will actually be very disempowering for individuals, and then other times will be also simultaneously empowering. And so I don't know that I have a sense of what you need, how much you need to get it, because I don't know that we can get it, right? I think it's always kind of continuing. And then the second thing that I really strongly believe in is that we put a lot of faith in education as this kind of silver bullet of development and empowerment. And education is only but one institution within our society, right? There are lots of things that have to happen on multiple fronts that don't take away from the importance of education, but also don't place all of the responsibility around and on education or schooling. Right now, let's also talk about the distinction between schooling and education, right? These are very two different things. But schooling, it's very much still this early kind of access-oriented, parity is the goal, get all kids in, without looking at what do these spaces look like? What does the curriculum look like? What are these non-schooling, non-formal spaces of education like? How is that going? How can we integrate that broadly within society such that change on all fronts is happening? It's unfair to put the weight of all of social change and empowerment on the shoulders of young girls going to school, right? There's so much, there's so little. I think I think that's only one part of a broader process. And so I try to, when you're sharing your stories and your frustrations, and I completely understand that, I try to put it in a bit of a broader perspective to understand,
Yeah,
be realistic.
Sure. But I think having lived in that environment myself, growing up in the village in a polygamous home, I really needed, and seeing these women, and I'm talking about education and all that, it was really frustrating. I remember smacking my thesis when I was defending it. It's like, why am I doing this? But thank you so much. I think it's so many layers, and you want these girls to be able to make choices. You want, like now I say that, no, okay, let me leave it.
Yeah,
thank you.
no.
Appreciate.
Great insights. No, thank you. Very good insights.
I'm cognizant of our time, and I want to thank all of you for attending today. And there are more questions in the chat box and that are coming in. So this has been a really engaging conversation, but we'll close off the recording at this point in time. And I encourage folks to reach out to Dr. Shah directly. If you want to put your email in the chat, we could, if you'd like, people can reach you directly. Otherwise, thank you all, and please come back for our next colloquium, which is October 21st. If I remember correctly, we have Dr. Regina, oh no, who is it, Katie? I can't remember, I apologize. Dr. Regina Cortina, I believe, is speaking on Latin America and her research there in indigenous communities. Thank you again, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
It's actually Gabriela Oliveira.
Oh, my mistake. Gabriela, she will be talking about mothering across borders between Mexico and New York City. A really great talk.
And then Regina is after that. Regina's after that.
Thanks.